Good morning and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. State governments and state universities are under tremendous financial pressures, causing presidents in the most recent ACE survey of college presidents that they are concerned about the long-term financial viability of their school now is the number two concern in the COVID-19 area behind student, faculty, and staff mental health. My guest today is Dr. James Johnson. Most recently, Jim was president of the University of Alaska system from 2015 to 2020, where he led the system through a historically challenging period marked by severe cuts in state funding, declining enrollment, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. He was a visiting scholar at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at the University of California, Berkeley, and has completed specialized training in negotiation and leadership at Harvard and finance at Northwestern, as well as his EDD from Penn. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Karen. Appreciate it. Nice to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of us who read a lot about higher education, Alaska was in the news quite a bit in the last 18 months over these financial challenges. Walk us through first what constitutes the Alaska system, and then also what some of those financial challenges were.
Yeah, often Alaska is prominent because of its size. It's the largest state in the country by far, 2.5 times the Texas, and that matters when it comes to delivering higher education. If you were to transpose Alaska onto the lower 48 states, Alaska touches the Atlantic Ocean, it touches the Pacific Ocean. And the system began in 1915, well before statehood. Statehood didn't occur until 1959. But forming up a university system was actually part of the pitch for statehood, because it was a territory back then. And folks thought, gosh, if we have a university and we have this and we have that, right, then the folks in Congress will say, okay, you can be a state. So going back to 1915, an act of Congress created the Alaska Agricultural College and School of Mines in Fairbanks. It didn't open until 1922 when 6 students showed up on the campus. But it was organized under the Morrill Act, so it got some land. I'll talk about that in a little bit. It's the land grant university without the land. Nevertheless, it started out then, and fast forward 1935, it became the University of Alaska, again, to try to pump up this notion of pride and credibility and gravitas for purposes of statehood. And then up to now, where you have 13 campuses, 3 universities, 1 doctoral research university, 1 comprehensive university in Anchorage that's the biggest, and then in Juneau, a smaller comprehensive university, and then all these community campuses that stretch out across the state. Half of the campuses are inaccessible by land.
Wow.
And 1,300 miles from the southernmost to the northernmost. So that's basically the distance for those of you watching, we're familiar with West Coast distances, it's the distance from San Diego to Seattle. So major challenge there in terms of geography. Its research is distinguished by its location. Of course, number 1 research university on the planet when it comes to Arctic fill in the blank, because Fairbanks is very close to the Arctic, and a lot of the research has to do with climate and the North Sea and oceanography and space physics and volcanology, seismology. The biggest earthquakes that have occurred in the United States over the last 100 years had their epicenters in Alaska. So it's a great place to study certain kinds of things.
And what is volcanology? I don't know what that
volcanoes.
is. Oh, volcanoes. Okay.
Yeah,
right.
the Aleutian chain.
Something else. Okay.
Yeah, it's the Aleutian chain is very active. And that, of course, is highly correlated with seismology, because there's the big northern plate is, along that arc of the north. So today, the budget is about $800 million, about 25,000 students. And I mentioned the land, we got 110,000 acres. Under the Morrill Act, should have gotten 500,000 acres. So that's a continuing struggle, but I think we can talk about that in a little bit later. 92% of the higher education that happens in Alaska happens at the University of Alaska. So it's the big player here. It's governed by a board of regents. It's a single entity. So even though there are all these different community campuses and 3 different universities, it's one financial entity, one legal entity. And that creates a tension that we can talk about.
Yeah.
Because from a decision-making standpoint, it's one. From an accreditation standpoint, it's 3. And that creates an issue here, as it does in many state university systems across the country, where the governance is set up under a constitution or statute with a board of regents or a coordinating board. And then you've got accreditors out here who frankly don't recognize systems very clearly, and that can set up some issues. And we certainly bumped into that as we were trying to figure out options for dealing with the budget cut that you mentioned a moment ago in your introduction.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. But we can talk more about
that. Let's dive into the budget a little bit. Let's talk about how Alaska traditionally makes its money, its different revenue streams that others.
Well, starting in 1974, it was making its money from oil and gas, primarily oil. There's an 800-mile long pipeline that runs from Prudhoe Bay down to Valdez. And so that's been the primary revenue source for the last 40 or so years. Alaska is a boom and bust natural resource economy. So first it was the Russians coming in and taking furs. Then it's, fish, timber, gold. Actually, timber is not an active part of the economy anymore, but gold is big. Zinc is very big. Oil still is big, though less than what it was. So those are the primary revenue sources to the state. The state did establish a permanent fund back in the 70s, and 25% of the revenue that comes off of oil goes into this endowment. And now it has become the single largest funder of state government. The earnings off of that investment fund. So a lot of foresight by the founders. A challenge, though, is, and it sets up a competition now, and it's one that the university has really had to struggle with, is between the permanent fund dividend that is paid out to Alaskans each year versus funding for things like higher education, healthcare, et cetera, K-12 education. So the single biggest expenditure of state government right now in Alaska is a dividend that is paid out to Alaskans.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's been a challenge for the state here recently. Even pre-COVID, oil prices were down. And so that really was putting a constraint on revenues to the state. And now, of course, with COVID, demand for oil, because economic activity was declining, airlines, shipping, et cetera. So it really put a crimp on revenues for the state. And that has resulted in very severe cuts to the budget. The university's budget's been cut continuously since 2015. The peak budget was 2014. And so just managing those reductions has been extremely difficult. The most difficult year really was last year when, in February of 2019, new Governor Mike Dunleavy proposed a 41% cut in the state appropriation to the university. And that wouldn't be a big deal if the university's dependence on the state were just 5 or 10%, as is the case in many parts of the country.
Right.
Ours is 40%.
Wow.
And so that was a big whack. Now we were able to successfully advocate through the legislative session to reinstate the budget. We were largely successful in doing that. And then on June 28th, just 3 days prior to the beginning of the fiscal year, the governor vetoed all the money that the legislature had reinstated in the budget, taking it all the way back to his 41% cut. And then we were under that cut for 6 weeks. We were able to negotiate our way out of it, but I think a lot of people, even here in Alaska, went through it, forget that that cut was in effect for 6 weeks. So we, not only were pushing hard to fight the cut, I was also negotiating directly with the governor to mitigate the effects of the cut, and we eventually got an agreement with him to bring down the reduction. But also doing the contingency planning for what are we going to do? How are we going to reduce here? And one of the big constraints around the reduction was the notice periods, the requirements for program reviews and long notice periods for making needed quick reductions. So our board declared financial exigency, and we started developing plans to dramatically reduce the number of academic units, the number of faculty, the number of staff. We explored a single accreditation as opposed to 3 accreditations, other means to try to reduce the overall cost structure.
Right.
And at the same time, we really thought that there were, and I think there still are, positive opportunities for a more seamless student experience. Our students really want to be able to move across our university system and take courses that are more convenient for them. And of course, post-COVID, that's really opened up. So how do we become more of a system academically and administratively too? And so trying to see a little bit of silver lining in a pretty difficult cloud. So we're trying to handle all that at the same time. And once we did get the agreement with the governor on August 13th, that halved the cut, so from 41% to about 21%, and then spread it out over 3 years. So we had a glide path. So the reductions could be planned anyway. Not perfect scenario by any stretch, but frankly, a whole lot better than the 41%. So the board withdrew the declaration of fiscal exigency, and then we asked the campuses to come up with the money. How are you going to reduce? And that work, since I left the university in July, is continuing. They're not, UA, I don't think, is close yet to developing the clear plan for making those reductions. But they're working hard at it. Then, of course, all of this happens in a political context. We have, I mentioned that permanent fund dividend, and the legislature's set amount for the dividend is less than the statute calls for and the governor wants. So there was a reaction by the voters during the primaries this year. And so a number of the legislators, particularly Republican legislators, who worked with Democratic legislators to fashion that reduced dividend to Alaska citizens, were voted out during the primary. So it may well be that we don't know yet, because of course November 3rd hasn't happened yet, but it may be that the legislature shifts even further in a fiscally conservative direction this year, which will reinforce, if you will, the constraint on the university. And I guess the last point I'd like to make here, and it's a really important point, is size matters. And our geography is huge, of course, which is a big factor, but we're relatively small. I mean, the whole University of Alaska system is a middle-sized university around the rest of the country. And what that means is that we have many fewer degrees of freedom for how to adapt and respond. If I were to compare us to, the Cal State system or the SUNY system or some of the other big systems, yes, they're under pressure too, no question about it, but the sheer size gives them more degrees of freedom, more capacity to adapt than the smaller systems do. I'm thinking of Vermont or New Hampshire or even Montana perhaps, but definitely Alaska. So that adds pressure, to the situation.
That's a great point. Can you dive a little bit more into then, with 3 campuses, and at that point you had 3 accreditations, is that right?
Yeah, right.
So how much of the accreditation factor do you have to weigh in the fund distribution, even though it's far less than what you need? How do you balance that all the way out?
Well, it's a great question. Accreditation wasn't so much a consideration in allocation of funds. We, to a great extent, allocated the reductions based on a formula. And we just took the percentage of general funds, that each unit had, and took pro rata reductions. But what we frequently, actually most of those years, Karen, what we did, including this past year, is we reduced a little deeper to create an investment pool, because we did want to invest in K-12 outreach. We did want to invest in recruitment and retention initiatives, into research. I mean, our return on research is huge. Six outside dollars for each $1 we put in. Very, very important. So we weren't just trying to figure out how to shrink. We were trying to also to try to grow at the same time.
Right.
So we used a formulaic approach to allocate the reductions, but we did go deeper. And then we would basically compete for strategic investments that were tied to meeting state goals. And those goals included attainment, and economic development and research, cost effectiveness, those sorts of things. And accreditation really came up as an issue, not so much in budget allocation, but when we were looking at restructuring to try to figure out how we could reduce costs.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of redundant academic units across the system. And so the question is, how could we reduce those? So instead of 19 colleges and schools, School of Education, College of Arts and Science, et cetera, we could have gone to 9. And had essentially the Alaska College of Engineering, the Alaska College of Education, the Alaska College of fill in the blank, as opposed to the UAF, UAS, or UAA.
Right.
So that, and accreditation definitely bumped into to that option. And then there were issues too of where decisions get made. And I think the assumption with accreditation, the big assumption is the decisions are made at the institutional level. Institutions are what's accredited, not systems. And yet, in certain systems like Alaska's, the big decisions are made at the system level and by the Board of Regents, not at the institutional level. So that's an unresolved tension in my view. And I know there are other system heads all across the country who are very concerned about that tension. And the constraints that regional accreditation sometimes puts on systems' abilities to deal with issues like this. We were in close touch with folks in Maine. Their system is moving to a single accreditation, I think largely to try to reduce cost and increase the seamlessness of the student experience. Connecticut state college and university systems looking at it, I think, and there may be others too across the country.
Well, that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you, is I'm sensing in my reading around the country that systems are under great stress for different reasons, but it all comes down to finances, declining number of students, fixed costs going up. And so I was wondering, is there anything besides the investment fund, which I really like, the idea, is there any other strategies that you might suggest to other systems who are looking at cuts like this?
Well, certainly the consolidating administrative systems, lots of people have done that. Let's put together the back room. That makes a lot of sense. There are a lot of risks, of course, to all of these things, and the greater distance between the campuses, the more risk there is. The smaller the system, the more risk there is. I think there's a lot of really good thinking right now being put into this by leaders of the National Association of System Heads, or NASH. And that group, and in fact, I'm associated with them, we are doing a lot of serious thinking about the role of systems in the future. So it's not just these fiscal factors, it's technological factors, but it's also the impact of COVID, which is a serious game changer. And then another is the very much unresolved problem of racial equity and racism across the country. And those, and COVID and that inequity issue, social justice issue, they're not separate from each other. As we know, as we read about the differential impacts of COVID, it's just exacerbating those historic structural problems. And so system heads now are doing a lot of thinking about the the challenges, but also the role that only systems can play in addressing some of these challenges. Often institutions they have certain abilities, no question about it. They're on the ground, they can do things very effectively that systems can't do. But there are also some synergistic effects of systems that enable and support institutions as they try to deal with issues on the ground. So it's a very good question, Karen, and there's a lot of good work that's going into that right now. In fact, the call I had just before our call this morning was with the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, and we are working together to try to figure this out.
It's a great question. It really is, because I can see it being replicated multiple times across the country.
Yeah.
Now,
Well, my friend at NCHEMS has a really great line, and that is, if you've seen one system, you've seen one system. So even though there are dozens of them across the country, because cultural factors, historical factors, geographic, financial, political, all play into it. So it's not the kind of thing you can just say, oh, California's got X or Pennsylvania's got something, we can just apply that here. It really doesn't work that way. But there are certainly things we can learn from each other, and that's exactly one of the great purposes of NASH is to spread out best practices and successes across the country.
That's great. In Pennsylvania, we actually have two systems. We have PASHE, and then we have the Pennsylvania State University system of 24 Commonwealth campuses.
Mm-hmm.
And prior to teaching, I was an athletic director at one of those Commonwealth campuses and learned how the philosophy of one university geographically dispersed was their mantra, and how we shared systems of, HR, common job postings, financial structures, admission structures. So there were some cost savings there. And so what I'm trying to do is use that understanding of how the PASHE, which is the state university system, which is schools like Shippensburg and Westchester and Kutztown and East Stroudsburg, that system is under great stress right now because there's simply no money in the state budget.
Right.
So oftentimes I'm asked, are there similarities between the two? And I'm not sure that I do see any similarities. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think there are some real positives of a system like that, because as I understand that system, and you come from it, so you would know, not the PASHE system, but the Penn State system actually is a single accreditation.
Yes, that's right.
It doesn't have N number of accreditations, as opposed to the PASHE system, where they're all in. And so you end up with, and this was our experience at Alaska, I suspect it's the case in the PASHE system as well, you end up with a structure, organizational structure at each of those individually accredited institutions that is probably larger than it needs to be simply to maintain the accreditation. And when we looked at our administrative structure and costs in the University of Alaska system, we found that the system office, which was of course in the middle of the target when everybody was trying to cut, was smaller than comparable systems budgetarily, only 3.5% of the total budget. But the big administrative, the amount of administration that was above peers was at the universities themselves. But then you get into employment issues, right? The economic impact of employment in those communities. So then you get politicians and chambers of commerce excited about it. So it's very, very challenging to manage these declines in ways that are not really controversial and painful. There's no question. And so folks, and there's, in many of these cases, there is no win, I don't think.
Yeah.
So
that's exactly where Pennsylvania is right now, because so many of the campuses are rural and their populations in their counties or areas are just not growing.
Yeah.
So
well, one thought here is, how does COVID teach us anything? One thing it teaches us is that online education, while not perfect, is something that we can do. So do some of those smaller locations become learning centers? Do they become places for K-12 outreach? Do they become more facilitators of content that is produced, a little more centrally? So maybe it doesn't apply, but the Western Governors University, for example, has over 90,000 students now, and they're booming. And competency-based, online, they're really being innovative and successful, and students are voting with their feet or their clicks to enroll there. And so I think we have to think about opportunities as well as we think about the challenges here.
So shifting gears just a little bit, I know system heads and offices don't have a lot to do with athletics. And if I'm correct, you have 3 different kinds of athletic programs in the Alaska system, right? You have programs on 3 different campuses. Is that
Actually, 2, Karen.
2? Okay.
Yeah.
Are they both Division 1?
They're Division 1 for hockey.
Okay.
And then I don't believe the division construct applies to Nordic skiing, cross country, rifle, some things like that. And we do have those kinds of teams, but generally speaking, in terms of volleyball, basketball, Division 2. So that's, I think, our primary classification, and then the hockey on top of that. And so that's been they provide tremendous values in terms of leadership development for the student athletes, a point of pride, certainly for the institutions and the community, a link between the community and the campuses. They are, however, very, very expensive, primarily because of the distance and travel costs, right? So we participate in the cost of bringing teams up to Alaska to play. Right. Our teams. And so that's been a big challenge. So we've looked hard at least when I was there, and they're looking at it still hard at how to trim the program so that they still meet the NCAA requirement to have at least 10 teams. And at each one of the universities, we explored combining, them, but felt let's go ahead and keep the 2 separate, and then, because rivalries are good, and then try to encourage philanthropy and more private support for the teams. Over the last several years, that has worked marginally well. And more recently, in light of current budget reductions, the University of Alaska Anchorage has announced its intent to reduce its program, so get rid of hockey, men's hockey, and women's gymnastics, and I believe there was one other sport they were thinking about reducing. But the compromise here was that if the community steps up and provides the philanthropic support, then there's the possibility that those sports could be continued.
Do you have the same kind of pressures that the other some of the other Division 1 and 2 programs have faced regarding Title IX and trying to keep a gender equity balance on your campus? Are you a split 50-50 in terms of male, female students?
Yeah, we are. So we're compliant in terms of that Title IX requirement. So that's, and in fact, sort of moving over to the Title IX challenges of the last number of years, prompted by the Obama administration's response to the scourge of sexual assault on campuses in the Dear Colleague letter of 2011. Actually, our athletics teams have been models of leadership, I think, and leading among students. Hockey teams, for example, really getting the training right away, and then getting out there and encouraging other students to get the training. So I frankly take my hat off to our student athletes for their leadership in that particular area. So yeah, I don't think that has, their academics have been very strong as well.
Yeah.
So actually, leadership in our athletics programs has been excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure it's always one of those things where when you're looking to cut places, it's oftentimes easy to say, well, we don't need to travel and play that game, or we don't need to invite that school here, but that impacts the competitive equity that you're trying to create amongst all of your teams to have the chance to play at the highest level you can.
Yeah, very, very true.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jim, I can't thank you enough for this great conversation about the systems.
Sure.
I think it's a really important conversation as we look at higher ed today, as it evolves. I think you're absolutely right that COVID-19 has been a disruptive event for all of higher education and will continue to disrupt us even when we get a vaccine, because I think we won't go backwards. on some of these.
Well, I think you're right, Karen. I agree with you. It is disruptive. I guess I'd also suggest that it is a magnifier or an amplifier as well. And that way, by using those terms, some of the negative aspects of what's happening, what problems that we haven't resolved, challenges that we haven't solved yet, are made worse by it. So hence your disruptive term. But there are also some things I think that are positive about it that have become more clear here. The importance of technology in enabling students to study on their terms, on their time, in ways they can. At the same time, though, the challenges are huge. Students without the technological capabilities, without the connectivity with jobs, et cetera, those are tough, tough challenges. And I guess maybe I think a lot about different kinds of challenges, and I think and this is really based on Ron Heifetz's work out of Harvard, the idea of technical problems or technical challenges versus adaptive challenges. And the technical ones can be solved with spreadsheets and PowerPoints and policies and rules and regulations. The adaptive challenges are much harder to solve. They can be managed, they can be approved upon directionally, but they can't be fixed by Tuesday of next week. They're the things that we need to really commit ourselves to long term. And so one of the things that I'm really thinking about is that long term. And I mentioned the group work that the National Association of System Heads is doing is, what about 2030? What about 2040? What is the long term here? And how do we begin to create that future now? How do we envision it? And then what are the policy implications? What are the changes, initiatives, investments, ways of thinking that need to change so that we can actually realize that very positive and important future of state university systems in America?
Absolutely. Great. Jim, thanks again for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great, Karen, and good luck. Have fun.
Thank you.